Boker or else. If you're like me, your head is filled with the music from that exquisite service this morning. It will be my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Rabbi Art Green. And I think at this point we already have at least a heart feel for who he is. His bio says he is a philosopher and a theologian, an internationally recognized historian of Jewish religion, but we know he's a mensch above mention. He is the founding dean of the Hebrew College Rabbinical School and currently serves as their rector and as the Irving Brodnick Professor of Philosophy and Religion. That's a mouthful. An accomplished scholar, an independent thinker, and a widely read writer. He has presented Jewish spiritual teachings within and beyond the Jewish world for decades. He has lectured widely and taught Jewish mysticism, Hasidism, and theology to several generations of students at the University of Pennsylvania, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where he served as both dean and president, Brandeis University, and Hebrew College. Much in demand as a lecturer, he's even delivered a series of lectures at Yale University. Art was the founder of Chavarat Shalom, an egalitarian Jewish community in Somerville, Massachusetts. Reb Zalman, Oliver Shalom, joined him there in the first year. And he remains a leading independent figure in the Jewish renewal movement. Art has been named to Newsweek's list of top 50 influential rabbis in America every year since 2008. Art grew up in Newark, New Jersey. We haven't even, okay, very good. In a fairly non-conservative Jewish home. While he has described his father as a quote-unquote militant atheist, his mom, having been raised herself in a traditional home, made sure that Arthur had a good Jewish education and made sure he attended Camp Ramah. In 1959, while attending Brandeis University, he went through a crisis of faith and sought out alternative approaches to Judaism. He was fortunate enough to have as his professors Nachum Glatzer, Alexander Altman, and he went on to earn his PhD and became the Philip W. Lown Professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, now emeritus. In 1967, he was ordained as a conservative rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, many of which are downstairs in our shuk. His most recent being Speaking Torah, Spiritual Teachings from Around the Maggid's Table. His works include Radical Judaism, Rethinking God and Tradition, A Guide to the Zohar, Ehyeh, A Kabbalah for Tomorrow, Seek My Face, A Jewish Mystical Theology. These are the words, a vocabulary of Jewish spiritual life, The Language of Truth, Teachings from the Sfat Emet, Keter, The Crown of God in Early Jewish Mysticism, Your Word is Fire, the Hasidic Masters on Contemplative Prayer, Devotion and Commandment, the Faith of Abraham and the Hasidic Imagination, and Tormented Master, a Life of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. He was the editor of Kol HaNeshama. Many of us use that in the Reconstructionist prayer book. He was an editor of Jewish Spirituality, co-editor of Mysticism, Hermeneutics, and Religion Studies in Judaism, editor and translator of Upright Practices and the Lights of the Eyes. Some of you may remember that Art was a keynote speaker at one of the early Ohala conferences. Is there anybody who was here when we were at College Inn in Boulder? Some of you may have met him in Reb Zalman's kitchen. His relationship with Reb Zalman goes way back, many, many years. Perhaps over half a century, huh? We'll ask him about the seminary without walls. Or better yet, how to cut onions for gefilte fish. This past year in March, celebrating Zalman's ecumenical legacy in Europa. He also participated in a dialogue of devoutness in honor of Rabbi Zalman Shlomo, joined by such eminent leaders as Mother Tessa Bielki, Pir Ibrahim Abdurrahman Farajajeh, and Rabbi Shaul Michael, and moderated by Acharia Judith Simmer Brown. On a personal note, shortly after Reb Zalman passed away 2 years ago, I was in Jerusalem, and like many of you, kind of lost in my grief. Ed Stathman was there as well, and we happened to have the mazel to go to Kol HaNeshama synagogue, where Art Green gave a moving and deeply meaningful haskara on Reb Zalman. I will be forever grateful for his words that day in Jerusalem, and am honored to present to you now Rabbi Arthur Green. Rabbi Green will speak for about 4 to 5 minutes, after which we will take some Q&A.
Thank you, my very dear Chaverim and Talmidim. It's wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be here in this place, of course, so established by my dear and so much missed friend and teacher of Zalman. Having even Shalom in the first row is very special, and I'm delighted especially to be here with you and to be here with everybody. I won't take a Jack's joke. We also know each other for more than half a century. There are 2 parts to this talk, and each one will begin with a story. The first part is the longer, so when I get to the second story, don't think I'm only halfway through. The first is the story of my greatest theological embarrassments. And a couple of you have heard this story. Forgive me for repeating it to you, but it needs to be shared on this occasion. It was the summer of 1972. I was 31 years old, a couple of years out of rabbinical school, and I was invited to participate in a seminar, an interfaith seminar, a meeting of, we called it the Holy Man Jam, people from all the world's religions. It was put together by a wonderful priest named Raimundo Panikar, a Catholic priest of Indian and Spanish origins, who was trying very hard to push beyond the limits of Catholicism in that wonderful, fresh Vatican II era. He was interested in Hindu-Christian dialogue in particular because of his own Indian heritage. And he called together this group of people from all over the world who were spiritual teachers in their various traditions. Oh, Swami Satchidananda, the founder of integral yoga, was there, and Pir Vilayat Khan, and Timothy Ware, a Greek Orthodox priest, and the founder of the Mount Baldy Zen Center in California, whom I'll tell you about in a minute. Shlomo Carlebach and I were the 2 Jews there. How I got there, I'm not sure, but there I was. It was held in a monastery upstate New York called Mount Savior Monastery, and the monks were our hosts and they were serving. At the end of the first day, the brothers, of course, in the monastery were old-time brothers. They weren't there just since Vatican II. They'd been there a long time. And they were kind of traditional. So after the first day, they went up to Panikar, who was a priest as well as a professor, and said to him, "What do you have to talk to these people about? They're not Catholics. They're all going to hell. What are you talking about meditation and spirituality? Well, you have nothing to learn from them." Panikar very wisely brought the question to the plenum. He said, "This is what the brothers have asked me. What shall I tell them?" Well, it was wonderful because, of course, all of us had people back home. Shlomo Carlebach had people back in the Orthodox community who certainly would wonder what he was doing there. And the Muslims, of course, we know well, certainly had many, many people back home who would ask the same challenge. And we began to talk about it. At that moment, the Japanese monk, who was announced had just founded the Mount Baldy Zen Center in California, I remembered, because he was bald, it was the Mount Baldy Zen Center, it was kind of funny. He got up, he hadn't said a word, of course, he got up and said, I won't imitate the Japanese accent, but he said, "For a Christian to say Christ is the only God is like a man who says, my wife is the only woman." That's it. I loved it. I I quoted that line for 50 years. Every time the question of chosen peoplehood came up, I said, there I was, now back in 1972, and I told the story, and I said, of course, I'm fully engaged in my marriage. I don't need to be in anybody else's marriage. I'm fully engaged by the covenant of Sinai. I come to God as a Jew. I fully inhabit my Judaism. I'm glad to know there are other good marriages out there. I wouldn't want mine to be the only marriage, right? I'm glad to know. I can't know them from inside. I don't need to know them from inside. And that was a conversation that I had sometimes. I would say, no, I really can't be inside any other, but I'm glad to know they're there. Well, as I say, if I quoted that once, I quoted it 100 times. Those of you who were my students probably heard me say it at one time or another. The summer before last, about 2 weeks after Zalman passed, I was back in the States. I opened the New York Times, and there was an obituary. Sasaki Roshi died at age 107. In 1972, it said he founded the Mount Baldy Zen Center in California, so there couldn't be any mistake that it was the same monk. And then it went on to say his career was unfortunately marred by the fact that he was a serial womanizer and seduced many of his female students. You understand? He knew my wife isn't the only woman. He followed his advice. That's why it became such a great theological embarrassment for me. Here I was quoting him all these years, my wife isn't the only woman. Guess what? She wasn't. Well, I had to ask myself, in that case, was all my openness to the possibility of other marriages and covenants somehow disloyalty, somehow unfaithfulness? Should I have stayed at home inside my marriage and said, no, I don't know about any others, this is the only one I know. Sinai is the only religion because otherwise I am unmasked as promiscuous. No, I can't do that. I can't do that because I know that religions acting alone without recognizing the legitimacy of the other are dangerous. Notice the terrible things religions do when acting alone. And notice how nicely those religions behave when acting in concert, when acting together. So I knew I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that also because the Zohar really taught me. The Zohar says, Ashrei man da'ayil u'nefik. Blessed is the person who comes in and out, who can walk in and out. And I understood it, it's my own reading of the Zohar, that means to be able to walk in and out of the Sfirot, to understand, yes, I live wholly in this mythic universe. I want to rescue the Shekhinah from exile and bring her together and restore the love. But I also know that all of that is just imaginary creation that comes out of the mysteries of abstraction that lead to the Ein Sof. The Zohar allows you to ask the question everybody was thrown out of Hebrew school for asking, where did God come from? God was born out of the mysteries of that which is transcendent and beyond. So I know all that. I know all that. I have transcended that mythic world, even though I choose to live within it. So I know that I cannot go back. I cannot go back. I am a postmodern religious person. A postmodern religious person means to me that I live after the great age of the new religion of scientism that took over the Western world between the 18th and 20th centuries, that suffered its terrible crisis in the middle of the 20th century, and that called upon many of the greatest minds of our time to go seek out the ancient wisdom of humanity and ask, what is there that we overlooked in the rush toward modernity? What is there that we set aside, putting science on the pedestal and saying it was the true faith? Maybe there's something there that will keep us from killing one another. Because we saw that the scientific age brought us to Hiroshima, if not Auschwitz and Hiroshima. Maybe there's something in those hidden traditions, in those rejected old traditions, that will help us change the pace at which we live and restore our humanity. So just as in Judaism, a new concept had been created at the turn of the 19th century called mainstream Judaism. Mainstream Judaism was a new creation in order to reject the mystical tradition which was embarrassing to modern westernizing Jews in Germany in 1800 and 1820. So in the other traditions too, some of the greatest had been set aside, and now it was time to recover it. We live in that age of recovery. We're blessed to live in that age of recovery. When Zalman and I were talking about Zohar and Hasidic text 50 years ago, there were no echoes. Nobody else was listening. But we have now come to an age when the Jewish people hungers to restore this part of our tradition, and when people all over the world are restoring those spiritual traditions. So, no, there's no going back. We are postmodern religious people. And postmodern religious people means that we understand the truth extends beyond us all. Each of us has a version of the truth. Each of us has a language for the truth. Each of us has a pathway to seek out that truth. And those pathways are precious and need to be preserved in their integrity and need to be updated at the same time and opened and expanded. But they all lead toward a truth that does not exclusively belong to any one of them. Now we have to look carefully at what's going on. You may say traditional religion fought two great battles across the 20th century. Battle against Darwinism and the battle against biblical criticism. So much of traditional religion was exercised with fighting these wars from 1892 to the end of the 20th century. Traditional religion decisively lost both of those battles. They're over. Yes, you can still find people who argue about whether you can teach evolution in Kansas public schools, but nobody takes it seriously. I remember in the 1950s, Lubavitcher Rebbe got up and said, no, the world really is 5,700, whatever it was, 62 years old, and God put the fossils there to test our faith, and God gave us carbon dating to test our faith, and we all kind of smiled and said, all right, he's Lubavitcher Rebbe, he has to say that, even though he too had a Western education, so I'm not sure quite how he got away with it with himself. But we all understand that those battles are over. The same with the battle against biblical criticism, even though you can't get up in your modern Orthodox synagogue and say it from the pulpit on Shabbos, it's understood somehow that yes, the Torah was edited over a long period of time. So you would think, given that decisive loss of both of those battles, that religion, especially traditional religion, would be a defeated force in the 21st century. Guess what? The religious life that's thriving is precisely the religious life that seeks to deny those realities, that seeks to deny that truth. Dangerous. Religions claiming exclusive truth. Religions existing outside the framework of working together. So when we come to look at deep ecumenism for our day and ask what we have to do, what kind of religious attitudes we want to cultivate in ourselves and in our students, the first thing we want, looking at deep ecumenism as copy, the language, of course, is copied from deep ecology. So we have to ask, how would deep ecology work in the ecumenical sphere? The first thing I want to say, of course, there'll be 3 points. The first thing I want to say is that we want to create a non-polluting religious path. A non-polluting religious path, which means a religious path that will not lead people to claims of exclusive truth, to putting the others down, to saying that we alone are chosen, we alone know, our religious language is the only one that counts. As we oppose the supersessionist claims of other religions against ours, we have to be careful not to be superior or condescending toward others. And that means a religious language that does not pollute, that does not lead us to dangerous and frightening places. I'll come back to that later. A side story. 1971, I think it was, the New York Times Magazine ran a story about Lubavitch. And the young woman reporter went to visit two Chabad families. One was a recent Baal Tshuva, and one were born and raised Chabad families. But first she went to the home of this Baal Tshuva. She went there on a Friday night, and his name was maybe Yehuda Leib, if I remember rightly. And she's sitting there with him and a group of guests in the living room, and his wife walks in from the kitchen with the gefilte fish, and he hollers at her and says, "Can't you see I'm teaching here? Can't you see we're busy?" Something like that. And very nasty. And I look at this guy's face and I say, oh my God, that's not Yehuda Leib, that's Gerald. He was in my study group on Hasidism at Brandeis in 1968. I remember he had the big jar of wheat germ he was always drinking. I remember very clearly who he was. And I remember that second semester I passed him on to Zalman, because Zalman was in town that year. So I called Zalman in Winnipeg and I said, did we do a mitzvah or did we do an Adorah? the best he could say, and it wasn't enough, was think of what a Russia he could have been had he not found Yiddishkeit. But it's sometimes hard. It's sometimes hard to say, yes, we have sent people to that place where they created a polluting kind of religion, even of our beloved Torah, that still exists in the world. My current project, I'm working on a lot of things at the same time. I love working on a lot of things at the same time. But the current book is a book on Neo-Hasidism. What is Neo-Hasidism? I want to say very clearly what it is and also what it isn't. It's going to be 2 volumes, Roots and Branches. The first volume is going to be Roots, and it's going to be Neo-Hasidic readings of Judaism, beginning with Martin Buber and Hillel Zeitlin in interwar Europe, how they tried to take the Hasidic tradition, the best of the Hasidic tradition, and separate it from its own klipot and present it for modern people. And then Neo-Hasidism is recreated by Zalman and Shlomo in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. Probably Heschel will come in between, certain essays of Heschel's which are really in the Hasidic spirit. Then maybe a couple of my own very youthful writings. And then in the second volume, we'll go on to talk about what Neo-Hasidism should be today. My beloved student Ariel Mays is the co-author with me, and he's writing an essay, a new call for a Hasidism today, just as Zeitlin called for a new Hasidism in 1920s Warsaw. He's going to write a call for a new Hasidism for our generation. And that second volume will begin with my Neo-Hasidic credo. That credo I've been writing and rewriting for the last 5 years or so. It was first published in a festschrift in honor of Neil Gilman, but I have rewritten it a couple more times, and it will go into the volume. I wanted to share just a little bit of it with you. Some of you will have copies of it in front of you, just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to say Neo-Hasidism is for our day. I did not intend to make it 13, but it just came out in the 13 form. I couldn't help it. So it's a credo and a commentary. It should be published with the text in the middle and the commentary around it like the Gemara. You can kind of picture it that way if you could find somebody. I think we found somebody now who's the graphic designer to set it up for us that way. That's the way it'll appear in the book. But I want to give you a sense of what my thinking is and where I want Hasidism to go in our day, and how I want to declare what Neo-Hasidism is. It doesn't begin with Jews. It doesn't begin with Judaism. It doesn't begin with tradition. It begins as a philosophical statement. There is only one. All exists within what we humans call the mind of God, where being is a simple, undifferentiated whole. Because God is beyond time, that reality has never changed. Our evolving, ever-changing cosmos and the absolute stasis of being are 2 faces of the same one. Our seeming existence as individuals, like all of physical reality, is the result of tzimtzum, a contraction or de-intensification of divine presence, so that our minds can encounter it, and yet continue to see ourselves as separate beings in order to fulfill our worldly task. Daily life requires us to live as separate individuals and to recognize both the boundaries between self and other and the great opportunity for communion with other souls. In ultimate reality, however, that separate existence is mostly illusion. God is one means that we are all one. And in the commentary you'll see that's Sod Shema Yisrael, and I'll talk more about that tonight. God's presence, Shekhinah, underlies, surrounds, and fills all of existence. The encounter with this presence is intoxicating and transformative, the true stuff of religious experience. Serving God, or worship in its fullest sense, means living in response to that presence, always. In our daily consciousness, however, divinity is fragmented. We perceive Shekhinah in an exile or unwhole state. Sparks of divine light are scattered and hidden everywhere, lurking behind both real and illusory shells. Our task is to seek out and discover those sparks, even in the most unlikely places, in order to redeem them, to raise them up and rejoin them to their source. This work of redeeming the sparks and restoring wholeness carried out in spiritual, physical and social planes, brings joy to Shekhinah and to us as we reaffirm divine and cosmic unity. I won't read all, just one or two more. That joyous service of God is the purpose of human existence. God delights in each creature in every single distinctive form taken by existence. But we humans occupy a unique role in the hierarchy of being, having the capacity for awareness of the larger picture and an inbuilt striving for meaning-making. That to me is the core of Revelation, that inbuilt striving for meaning-making. When God says to Adam in Gan Eden, Ayeka, where are you? That to me is the essential revelatory word. And it's spoken, of course, from deep within the self, not in words and language. The Anochi and Lo Yelecha of Sinai, to me, is a repetition in our language of the Ayeka, of the where are you of Eden. We are called upon to develop that awareness to our fullest ability and to live our lives in response to that awareness, each of us thus becoming a unique image of God. Skipping down a bit, number 5, the essence of our religious life lies in the deep inward glance, a commitment to a vision of spiritual intensity and attachment to the One. Outer deeds are important. Ritual commandments are there to be fulfilled, and that leaves lots of room for the great variety of my Talmidim, from the very strictly observant to the just tasting the water of observance. Ritual commandments are there to be fulfilled. They are the tools our tradition gives us to achieve and maintain awareness. Each such mitzvah is to be seen as a great gift, an opportunity to stand in the divine presence in a unique way. But the mitzvot are to be seen as means rather than ends, as vessels to contain the divine light that floods the soul, or as concrete embodiments of the heart's inward quest. And so on. That's the religious language I seek to speak. It's the religious language I seek to make Hasidism speak for us again. It's something that goes beyond borders. It's something that reaches into the heart and is about the language of the heart. On the other hand, I go on to say all of this comes right out of Torah, and Torah is very important, and I talk about things like men and women and charismatic leadership and all kinds of other things you might expect in talking about Neo-Hasidism for today. But it's a religion that essentially is the language of the heart, and using Judaism to become a language of open-heartedness. The second aspect of deep ecumenism for today, the phrase has been mentioned several times already. Zalman always taught us about a dialogue of devotion. A dialogue of devotion, asking the other, the religious other, what does it mean to you to be a religious human being? What does it mean to you to stand in God's presence? Or if that's not your phrase, tell me what phrase is your phrase for what I call standing in God's presence. What does it mean to open your heart? Zalman began with Christians. I knew Zalman best in what we call this Catholic period. And he was always coming from brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so and visiting Regina Laudis or the brothers in Weston whom I still visit and who still remember him affectionately, and I still go there for a retreat. And in those days it was about the Psalms. Zalman discovered dialogue through the Psalms. Reading the Psalms as a Jew, reading the Psalms as a Christian, especially a Catholic Christian, because of course psalm chanting in monastic communities is so very much alive, and talking about what this psalm says in our liturgy and what this psalm says in your liturgy. That was the beginning of a much wider dialogue for Zalman, but it started there. And it's a good place for us to start too. What does it mean to say, Hashamayim, Shamayim, Ladonai, V'aretz Natan Livnei Adam? What does it mean to say, Zehayom Asa Hashem, Nagila V'nismechavo? I turn to Hallel, because Hallel was on the docket today. In Hallel, a line from my commentary on Hallel, Ahavti ki yishma Adonai kol Adonai. That's not an answer to the question, what do I love? It's an answer to the question, how am I capable of loving? Ahavti, how can I love? What makes me able to love? And the answer is, Ki yishma Adonai kol Adonai, because there's somebody listening. And that allows me to open my heart, allows me to be vulnerable enough to let myself love. With all the pain that love brings with it, with all the fulfillment and all the non-fulfillment that love brings with it, I can open my heart. I dare to open my heart. I dare to be ahavti. If you look at old manuscripts, you'll see the word ahavti written in big letters all by itself. Ahavti. What makes me love? Ki yishma Hashem et kolei tachanunai. To be able to share that with people who know the psalm and care about the psalm, but then, of course, sharing with people who don't know that psalm. So maybe your partner knows a poem by Rumi instead of a psalm from Tehillim, because that partner comes out of the Sufi tradition, and that's a different kind of love. Now, I'm a Shir HaShirim Jew. I love the Zohar, as I said at the Zohar conference in Israel last week. I love the Zohar for many reasons, but probably because it puts Shir HaShirim, it puts the Song of Songs at the very heart of Judaism. There's hardly a page in the whole Zohar that doesn't quote a verse from Shir HaShirim or use the imagery of Shir HaShirim. I said to somebody the other night, you want a nature-based Judaism, learn Shir HaShirim by heart. Hasidim and Mizrahi Jews recite all of Shir HaShirim every Friday night before Kabbalat Shabbat, and they know it by heart, they know the text by heart. I remember the first time I heard Shir HaShirim chanted in the Moroccan synagogue in Jerusalem. Little boys, little soprano-voiced boys, 7, 8 years old, were each chanting a chapter. And I said, what do they think this is about? What do they think this song about breasts is about? Then I realized, no, it's shul language. They're not noticing that the words mean anything. It's just like, even though they know Hebrew, it's just like saying things in shul, you don't pay attention. But Shir HaShirim, love as the basis of dialogue. How do I love? How do you love? What is the place of love in your religious life and mine? It's not all the same. It's not all the same. And nuances and differences are important. So when we talk about a Shir HaShirim-based Judaism, that's not the same as a fundamentalist Christian getting up and saying God is love. It's not the same. We don't have the distinction between eros and agape in our tradition. Christ's love, which is pure love, agape, which is pure giving love that has no erotic basis for it. No, we don't have that. We don't have that. I spend much of my time these days reading a Hasidic Sefer, the Marinayim, my very favorite of the early Hasidic Sfarim, and he knows very well that love is a continuum. All love is eros, and all eros is the love of God. Freud and the Maggid of Mezrich both understood the great secret. Freud was pretty Jewish in background, you know. They both understood the great secret that there's only one love. It's one continuum. Freud begins looking at it from the bottom and says, well, everything is sublimated eros. It's sublimated libidinal energy. And you get further and further into sublimation until you finally get to this abstract stuff that people who don't have a sex life call the love of God. But the Maggid of Mezrich looks at that same continuum from the top and says, no, there's only the love of God, there's only Ahavat Hashem, and then it exists in more corporealized and even fallen states. But all love comes from the love of God. So he quotes this frightening verse about incest from Vayikra, Ishki kachat achoto chesedu, and he says even forbidden taboo love is chesed, is a form of divine love, and he quotes that 4 or 5 times to tell you how much he wants to underline that there's only one continuum of love, that it all comes somehow. It's also now a fallen state of chesed, of divine chesed, that of course needs to be uplifted and transformed. Not all love is the same. When we talk about love, and people in South India talk about love with their very erotic sculpture in the South Indian temples that makes any Westerner either blush, embarrassed, or run away, you say, well, is that the same as the Zohar? Because the Zohar too is talking about the union of male and female. Not the same. Not the same, but we can learn a lot from one another. We can learn a lot from one another when we realize that we may, sometimes, I as a Shir HaShirim Jew, may have more in common with that Indian seeker in that temple or with that Sufi poet than I do with that Litvisha Misnagid who is busy trying to tamp me down with too much musar and too much diktuk in mitzvot. Maybe I have more in common with that person, but then I know that I have an awful lot in common with that Litvish Yid. My grandfather comes from his place after all. I have more in common with that Litvish Yid than I will ever have with anybody who comes from the religious world of India, partly because of our unique history together, but partly because essentially we speak the same spiritual language. Yes, he and I may differ in our use of it, and the emphases may be different, and I will choose things out of that spiritual treasure book that he will not choose, and yet somehow we have that in common. So the lines are multiple and cross all kinds of boundaries. There are typological lines where I would say, yes, sometimes I have more in common with this, with a Taoist who came to hear me speak at the Center for World Religions at Harvard recently and said, I want to translate your book into Chinese because this is a bridge between Judaism and Chinese religion. Sometimes I feel I have more in common with him, and sometimes I go back to my grandparents' very Jewish world. My grandmother was the pious one, my mother's mother was the pious one in the family, and she lived a life of women's piety that took place mostly in the kitchen in the cemetery. And that was very important to me and very precious to the growth of my own spiritual life. And so simplistic statements about all religions are one, simplistic statements about we're all saying the same thing are not helpful. But openness to learning from the other and to understanding the other as something to teach us, which will help us cast new light on our own spiritual traditions, on our own spiritual language, and we'll make that language both deeper and broader. That's very important. Deeper and broader. My friend the Mori Naim, as I said, my favorite Hasidic Sefer, I believe, is the creator of a new phrase that didn't exist before, Harchavat Gvul HaKdusha. Harchivat Gvul HaKdusha, to expand the boundaries of the holy. That phrase was picked up by Rav Kook, who used it a great deal in talking about his attitude toward modern Zionist efforts and so on. And that sense that we want Gvul HaKdusha to be always expanding and always to be pushing on it and finding Kedusha in more and more places. That which I read from the Credo about raising sparks from unexpected places, that's what makes Hasidism exciting. There is a sense of spiritual adventure. You have to go down into the klipot and find those sparks. You have to be very careful in doing that. You can be harmed. You can get trapped there. And those klipot, well, when they talked about it in Eastern Europe 200 years ago, it was when talking to a guy in the marketplace in your market stall. All right, it wasn't so terrible. But now we think of the klipot. We see the klipot we have to deal with in the world of Hollywood's values and Wall Street's values and the pornography in the midst of which we live. And I mean pornography on all kinds of levels, not just the simple, obvious level. The kind of debased universe in which we live, and to say nitzotzot kedusha are to be found there, and we have to be involved in uplifting and transforming. That's frightening and dangerous work, and I don't want to make it seem overly simple, but I think it is the work we have to do. We have not joined in traditional Hasidism's disdain for the modern world and closing ourselves off from the modern world. That's not who we are and how we will live. But we have to approach that modern world with the sense that we have a religious duty. We have a religious duty of finding Kedusha in new and transformative places, and uplifting those sparks and bringing them back to their source. The third thing I want to say about dialogue about deep ecumenism today is avoiding spiritual imperialism. And that's important. I want to go back to that conference with Professor Panikar, whom I had great respect and affection for. Panikar, at the end of that conference, thought he was doing something wonderful and open. He talked about the five senses, and the five senses will come and all be brought together, and we'll have all the sensual experience of mankind. And then he talked about the four directions, north, east, south, and west, and up and down, all the directions would come together. I remember for the sense of hearing, Shlomo Carlebach was called upon to blow the shofar. And for the sense of smell, there was incense, of course. And for the sense of sight, there was something else beautiful. And all of a sudden, in the midst, having drawn together all the senses and all the directions and all the worlds, suddenly Panakar lifts a cup and says, "This is my body." And we realize we've all been brought into, without telling us in advance, a universal mass that he was proclaiming. Because the word Catholic, as he said, means universal. And all of us are welcome, and all of us are part of this universal. And I turned to Shlomo and I said, Kreplach. Kreplach. You remember the story of the boy who hated Kreplach? Right? So his mother decides, all right, she's gonna show him, and she mixes the meat, and she mixes some onion in, and she puts the spices in, and she gets water and flour, and she rolls out the dough. He's very excited. What's going on? And she takes a piece of dough and cuts it off, and she takes a piece of the meat and puts it in the dough, and he's looking, and she folds down one side and folds down. When she folds down the third side, he says, "Oy, Kreplach." So I said to Shlomo, Kreplach, and he understood immediately what the reference was. But I can be guilty of the same thing. I can be guilty of the same thing. In the 4th chapter of Radical Judaism, I talk, inspired by some Christian friends and seekers, about expanding the notion of Israel. We are all Israel. Israel is so holy a name, it can't belong just to us Jews. I want to open it up and go back to its literal meaning and say, it's all those who wrestle with God. Anyone who wrestles with God, who has struggled with the angel all night, who spent all night wrestling with that angel. When you wrestle with an angel all night, by the way, you don't know where wrestling begins and lovemaking ends. You spend a whole night with that angel, struggling and loving and struggling. And I wanted to say, everybody who does that is part of Israel. But there are people who want to say, thank you, I don't want to be part of your Israel. Israel is not part of what I aspire to be. And so I have to be careful not to include my Zen Buddhist friends in an Israel not of their desire. My Christian friends generally love it, want to be part of it, but people outside the Christian world do not have that same attraction to being part of Israel. So being careful about spiritual imperialism, letting the other be as other as she needs to be, without putting her or him into my categories and saying, yes, this is how I can understand you as legitimate. I do not think it is our place to legitimize Christianity as a faith. And I do not like us being put in that position. Don't you believe there are two covenants after all? We accept now that your covenant, don't you accept also our covenant? And therefore, we Jews and Christians have a unique relationship to God, which those Hindus don't. They're still pagans. I avoid that one like the plague if I can. Your religious legitimacy is about your relationship to God and about your sacred language's relationship to God. It does not depend on mine. I understand the historical connections, and we can talk about those from night bis morgen, from today till tomorrow, but that's not where your spiritual legitimacy comes from. So those are things I wanted to say about dialogue of devotion, about deep ecumenism. I wanted to say something about a non-polluting religious life, something about sharing those inner devotional places with the other, and something about avoiding imperialism. And now I want to come to a second story. The second story just happened. I just came back from Israel. I go twice a year these days. I'm very blessed to have things to do there that take me there that often. And one of the things I went for this time was teaching a very, very special group of people, a group of Israelis involved in a program called Smicha Yisraelit, which is a non-denominational effort trying to create rabbis for so-called, quote-unquote, secular Israelis. Because people realize that there is no moral leadership in Israel coming out of the Jewish tradition. The secular authors like Amos Oz and David Grossman have become the conscience of the country because there is no real rabbinate, there is no real moral leadership that's steeped in Jewish tradition. And so the Midrashai Oranim, which is the kibbutz movement intellectuals, and the Shalom Hartman Institute got together last year and said they want to create a new program for training rabbis. The people in the program, they started with a very advanced group. They all have at least master's degrees. Some of the men coming from the Orthodox world have smicha already. They're all very advanced kinds of students, but they're opening, they go to Oranim once a week to study Zionist classics and Jewish ethics, and they go to Hartman once a week to study traditional Jewish sources, and I've been privileged now to have been invited to teach them twice. Well, I talked to them about neo-Hasidism, and they said, yes, we have neo-Hasidism in Israel too. Hasidism is very popular on the West Bank these days. In fact, the so-called Noar HaGvaot, those young people with a long payas running around with a big kippot and the young payas, burning down churches and committing murders here and there and doing horrible things, they are neo-Hasidic Jews. Isn't that wonderful? Neo-Hasidism. Last year I was interviewed by a newspaper called Makor Rishon, which my friends call a settler newspaper. But they have a very good Musaf Shabbat. And the editor of the Musaf Shabbat is a lovely man, and he interviewed me, Elchanan Nir, a poet, very sensitive person, and it was a good interview. So I bought, this time when I went, I bought a copy of Makor Rishon just to see what was there this week. And there was an article that broke my heart. It was teaching by Tzadok Cohen of Lublin. He was a Hasidic master who died in 1900, quite fiercely anti-Zionist, talking about how Jews have no place in this world, but Jews are wholly of the other world. Well, the authors of this article have managed to twist him in such a way that he approved of the taking of the land from Arabs in the West Bank. But once we have the land, even if the land came ba'avera, even if there was some avera in our taking the land, well, we can't. We have to be responsible and keep it. Look at David and Bathsheba. David and Bathsheba, after he killed Uriah Hittite, which he shouldn't have done, he didn't divorce Bathsheba, did he? He kept Bathsheba, and so we have to keep the land. It was just a horrible distortion of Judaism, of Hasidism, of a Hasidic master's teaching, and I was kind of heartbroken reading it, and it renewed in me a sense that I have, and this is what I want to leave you with. We have a struggle going on for the soul of our tradition. The same struggle is going on in Judaism that we see in every day's headlines going on in Islam. Don't be deluded by the fact that we are not beheading people yet. We're getting closer and closer all the time. And that struggle for the soul of Judaism, is it an exclusivist tradition? Is it a narrow tradition? Is it a tradition that only justifies us in the world and doesn't care about anybody else? Or is it a great universal spiritual and moral teaching? That struggle going on primarily in Israel, but going on in American Jewish life too, because that Israeli stream is supported from this country, and the money for it and everything else that happens, and it comes out of this country. So what we teach is terribly important, how we use this tradition, where we take Hasidism and what we proclaim it to be, and how we see a reborn and living Jewish spirituality coming out of it, and where we take it morally, is terribly important. We have to convince the Jewish people. We have to convince the Jewish people. We are rabbis, many of us, or other spiritual leaders, or lay people who have chosen to give our lives to rediscovering the spirit of Judaism. And that means we are Manhigei Yisrael, we are leaders of the Jewish people. Some of my students say, I came into this Jewish business for my own spiritual life, my own spiritual growth. I didn't know I was taking on the mantle of leadership of the Jewish people, but you are. And that means responsibility for this tradition. And that means responsibility for which way this people carries it forward. Maimonides was a deeply enlightened philosophical mystic. He understood that many of the things we say in the daily liturgy, many of the things, the ways we act in our ordinary normative Jewish life, are things he didn't need anymore. But he still did them, he still codified them in his law because they were needed for the people. Sometimes I feel I could live in the world of Gadlut HaMochin. I could live in the world of oneness with God, and then wouldn't need a lot of the language of the Siddur anymore, wouldn't need a lot of the daily Judaism I do. But I do it because I have somebody to convince. I have my Mochin de Katnus guy. I have my ordinary weekday, dull Tuesday afternoon guy to convince inside that, hey, this Gadlut stuff is really true. And I can only speak to that fellow in the language of Katnut. So therefore I keep the language of Katnut, I keep the language of I and thou, I keep the language of Baruch Atah, I keep the language of classical Jewish piety as I've inherited it from prior generations, because I need to remind my ordinary weekday self of the greater, deeper truths, and that's the language it speaks. We need to keep a lot of the forms of tradition because we need to be able to speak to Jews. We need to be insiders to the tradition, not outsiders. We need to feel like insiders ourselves, like the tradition is ours and is us, and we need to be seen that way. To position ourselves as marginal to the tradition disempowers us. It does not allow us to say, this is what Judaism stands for. This is where we want the tradition to go. Leaders of the Jewish people means that we have to be careful that this tradition doesn't become poisoned. And it can be. Of all the terrible things that happened in Israel in the past year, the one that hurt me most was that burned church up in the Galilee, where the people who burned it wrote on the walls, "La'avir gilulim min haaretz," to cause abominations to pass out of the land. For them, a Christian church in the Holy Land was an abomination. La'avir gilulim min haaretz, of course, a phrase they took right out of the Aleinu. You know where they took it from. For us, of course, the abominations are acts like theirs. But we have to have the standing to be able to say that. And that means being daveners who still say that Aleinu, who still say that language. That language is ours, it's part of us.
Right.
We have to be close enough. We have to be close enough to the tradition to be authentic leaders of it and spokespersons for it. Our return to Judaism. Many of us returned. I returned from a college year's rejection, spent a lot of years in a very ambivalent relationship to observance, and finally came back because this is who I am and this is who I want to be. Our return is a postmodern move. Yes, we are not going back to those forces of pre-modern Judaism that have been waiting along all along and said, oh, welcome back. You finally realized that modernity was a hoax. Welcome back, let's recreate the 18th century. We're not going there, not in the role of women, not in the style of leadership, not in the nature of authority. We're not going there. We are postmoderns. We understand there is truth everywhere, and that we have one language for it, but that truth also embodies all the other great spiritual languages of humanity. We know that. But we do not want to say that we are post-Jewish. We do not want to say that we stand outside, that we represent something entirely different, a break with the past. On the contrary, we want to inhabit that past and to take it with us and to be the people who assure that it will be used in a way that will be humanizing, that will be spiritualizing in the broadest sense, and that will bring us to be the kind of religious human beings we want to be and we want to create in the generation of those we teach. We may have come to this tradition hoping to change it, hoping to say, yes, it needs to be improved, we have something to give to it. In the course of that, as we live our lives, we discover that we were more changed than it was changed. And that's okay. That's part of what it means in this postmodern world to be involved in the spiritual life. It's what our life of faith is all about. We have something to give to the tradition, we recognize that, and we have spent a lot of time and effort reshaping and giving. At the same time, as long as we have taken the opportunity to reshape the tradition, that tradition has had the opportunity to reshape us along the way. That's what our journey of faith is all about. Thank you, my friends. Go on. We have time for some questions.
Dan's gonna explain.
Yes, go ahead.
Many of you know that in the past we've had a great teacher come to teach us. We've had a Q&A, had the microphone set